Saudi Arabia is in discussions with China to price some of its oil sales in yuan. Let's continue with our emerging action conversation here with Bloomberg's Sherry-Ann, co-anchor of Bloomberg Daybreak Asia. And Sherry-Ann, this is primarily oil that they're going to buy.
Imagine a world in which the dollar is no longer the main instrument of global trade, where major oil deals are no longer conducted in U.S. currency but in yuan, where countries that have depended on Washington for decades no longer wait for instructions from Capitol Hill but chart their own course. This scenario is no longer science fiction. It is becoming reality. Today's story is about a tectonic shift that could change the global balance of power. Saudi Arabia, one of the United States' most loyal allies and a key player in the oil market, is taking a step that seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. After decades of trading oil exclusively in dollars, the kingdom is considering the possibility of settling accounts in Chinese currency. And this is happening not somewhere on the periphery.
This is not necessarily something new. We know that they've been trying to sort of push this, but they haven't necessarily been successful in striking a deal.
For about 6 years, we've had these conversations. It looks like the debate is now being ramped up. We know that China buys about 25% of oil.
But at the very center of the global economy, at the intersection of Washington and Beijing's interests. Why is this important? Because the dollar is not just a piece of paper. It is the foundation of American influence, the instrument through which the U.S. controls global flows of capital, resources, and politics. If this instrument begins to lose its power, everything will change, from oil prices to the structure of international alliances. Saudi Arabia, long considered part of the American security architecture, is increasingly looking to the east. China offers not ideology, but benefits, investment, technology, infrastructure, and most importantly, respect for sovereignty. While Washington builds relationships through pressure and sanctions, Beijing is betting on cooperation and development, and for Riyadh, this is becoming a decisive argument. Against the backdrop of the trade war between the U.S. and China, accompanied by multi-billion-dollar tariffs, the threat of losing its main export market for oil has forced the Saudis to consider.
It's the idea right now that if you look at history, could this happen? Well, yeah, we have seen other dominant currencies in the past, right? What the Dutch currency in the 17th, 18th century, the Spanish dollar, then you had sterling, then you had the US dollar.
Can they remain dependent on a single partner? The answer was obvious. The country began to diversify its ties, inviting Chinese corporations to participate in energy and technology projects, and is now taking the next step. According to sources close to the negotiating circles, the transition of some oil contracts to the yuan, including digital payments, is being considered. This is an alarming signal for Washington. The loss of trust on the part of Riyadh is not just a diplomatic failure, it is a threat to the entire system, which is based on faith in the dollar. If the largest oil exporter starts selling its fuel for another currency, other countries may follow suit. Russia, Iran, India, and Brazil are already conducting transactions in their national currencies. Saudi Arabia could be the stone that starts the avalanche. While the White House discusses new tariffs and threats of sanctions, the world is changing. China is strengthening ties, creating parallel financial networks, and steadily approaching the moment when the dollar will cease to be the only option. And when that moment comes, the world we have known for the last 80 years will disappear. It will be replaced by a new reality, multipolar, unpredictable, and perhaps more dangerous. What will happen if the dollar loses its status as the world's currency? How will the price of power change if America can no longer dictate terms? And what role will Saudi Arabia play in this great redistribution? The answers are in this issue.
I think the narrative has changed a lot in the last 2 years. Before the pandemic had hit, before we saw these massive lockdowns in China, we were hearing more about the yuan internationalization. It seems
over the past decade, the United States has experienced a gradual erosion of its global influence. Washington once dictated world rules, set economic standards, and shaped the agenda of international relations. But the era of unconditional leadership is coming to an end. Administrations come and go, rhetoric changes, but the result remains the same. More and more countries are beginning to doubt America's reliability as an ally and guarantor of stability. Mistakes have been accumulating for years, from unsuccessful military campaigns and diplomatic failures to clumsy economic policies based on sanctions and tariffs. After Joe Biden came to power, promises to restore American leadership turned into a series of contradictory decisions. On the one hand, the White House tried to strengthen relations with allies in Europe and Asia, while on the other, it continued the line of economic pressure begun under Donald Trump. As a result, the world saw not a united America, but a country that had lost its strategic direction. Saudi Arabia, one of the U.S.'s key partners in the Middle East, was one of the first to feel the consequences of this instability. For a long time, Washington believed that the alliance with Riyadh did not require any special effort. Arms supplies, protection from external threats, and a guaranteed oil market created the illusion of a strong alliance. But when the U.S. sharply restricted military contracts in 2022 and began to openly criticize the kingdom for human rights violations, trust was undermined. For the Saudis, this was a signal. America is willing to sacrifice allies for domestic political gain.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Behind the scenes of diplomatic statements, there were increasing rumblings that Washington was no longer capable of being a predictable partner. Against this backdrop of tension, the world was changing rapidly. The trade war between the U.S. and China escalated into a global economic restructuring. Washington raised tariffs and restricted technology exports, while China responded by creating alternative trade routes and strengthening its presence in regions previously dominated by America. This was particularly noticeable in the Middle East, where Beijing began to actively invest in energy and transport infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative. Saudi Arabia did not stand aside. It began to receive Chinese delegations, sign agreements on the construction of industrial zones, and develop technological partnerships that were previously considered an exclusive privilege of the Americans. The Biden administration failed to recognize the scale of these changes in time. Washington believed that Saudi Arabia's economic dependence on the American oil market and defense supplies would guarantee its loyalty, but in fact, the opposite happened. The more pressure the U.S. put on its partners, the more actively they sought a way out. When new tariffs on Chinese imports were introduced in 2024, Riyadh saw this not as a temporary measure, but as a sign of a deep crisis in American economic strategy.
Really build on that relationship, and I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Officially, relations remained warm. Statements about a long-term partnership, joint conferences, defense contracts, all this remained in place. But behind the facade, a new movement was beginning. Saudi analysts openly discussed the idea of financial diversification, the possibility of conducting some oil transactions in other currencies, including the yuan. Although officially this was presented as a technical experiment, much more serious arguments were being made within the Riyadh administration. According to local media reports, one of the royal court's close advisors called dollar dependence the geopolitical risk of the 21st century. These words reflected what had long been in the air. American policy began to be perceived not as leadership, but as pressure. Interference in the internal affairs of allies, constant threats of sanctions, criticism of traditional regimes, all this undermined respect for Washington. When the Biden administration froze some high-precision weapons deliveries after the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, Riyadh saw it not as a moral gesture, but as a betrayal. At the same time, the U.S. didn't offer any alternatives.
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions.
No economic incentives, no security guarantees, just reproaches and demands. A new reality gradually took shape. In 23, China offered Saudi Arabia an investment package worth more than $80 billion, including the construction of a giant petrochemical complex in Jubail and a joint research center for the development of hydrogen energy technologies. These projects essentially replicated those that Washington had refused to finance 5 years earlier. For Beijing, it was a strategic move. For Riyadh, it was an opportunity to break out of its unilateral dependence on the U.S. Meanwhile, concern was growing in Washington. Internal State Department reports leaked to the press warned Saudi Arabia has started playing its own game. An analyst noted that the U.S. policy of isolationism under the guise of pragmatism was leading to a loss of trust among key partners. But changing course proved difficult. Domestic problems, inflation, political polarization, growing public debt distracted attention from foreign policy. Thus began the second stage of the crisis, a rethinking of the very essence of U.S.-Saudi relations. Back in the mid-20th century, they were based on a simple principle: oil in exchange for security. The U.S. guaranteed protection from external threats.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
while Saudi Arabia ensured a stable supply of energy resources. This formula worked for decades, but in the 21st century, it began to crack. The Saudis increasingly doubted Washington's ability to deliver on its promises. After the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan and the ambiguous response to the conflicts in Yemen and Syria, the kingdom seriously questioned whether the U.S. was prepared to defend its interests in the event of a real threat. At the same time, internal reforms led by the Crown Prince required new sources of investment. China was ready to offer them without political conditions. While Washington tried to dictate the pace of reforms and interfered in internal politics, Beijing acted gently, offering mutually beneficial cooperation. For the Saudis, this was a breath of fresh air. In 2024, Saudi Arabia officially joined a number of projects under the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese corporations began construction of logistics hubs and transport hubs on the Red Sea coast. According to experts, these projects may, in the future, become part of a new energy corridor between Asia and the Middle East, which will operate independently of American supply routes. This became a symbol that Saudi Arabia no longer sees itself merely in the shadow of the United States. Washington saw these events as a warning sign, but instead of dialogue, threats followed. U.S. senators discussed the possibility of restricting Saudi Arabia's access to advanced weapon systems and revising the terms of oil supplies.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
But this move proved counterproductive. The kingdom only accelerated negotiations with China on the joint production of unmanned technology and energy equipment, thus ended the era when Washington could rely on Riyadh's unconditional loyalty. Now there is a pause between the countries, not a break, but a cold distance, behind which one senses fatigue with the old order. American experts call this a crisis of predictability. Allies no longer understand what to expect from the U.S., and in a world moving toward multipolarity, such unpredictability becomes dangerous. This has been the main consequence of the decline of American leadership. Saudi Arabia is not just an ally, but an indicator, a litmus test of global trust in Washington. Having lost its unconditional support, America risks losing not only its influence in the Middle East, but also the very symbol of its power, the belief that the U.S. is capable of ruling the world. While the White House continues to argue over tariffs and sanctions, Riyadh is already preparing new agreements with Beijing. And although officially there's talk of a strategic balance, unofficially this balance is increasingly tilting in favor of the East. The world is changing quietly without loud statements and political declarations. But every new agreement between Saudi Arabia and China, every step toward reducing dollar settlements, and every American démarche based on pressure, brings closer the moment when the role of the U.S. as a world leader will cease to be unquestionable.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
And then, perhaps, the alliance built on oil and weapons will go down in history as an example of how a great partnership collapsed under the weight of its own self-confidence. While relations between Washington and Riyadh were falling apart, China methodically strengthened its position. What began as economic cooperation gradually turned into a strategic partnership. Saudi Arabia, pursuing a course of diversification, did what the United States did not expect. It opened its doors to Beijing wider than ever before. China, accustomed to acting quietly, seized the moment perfectly. While American diplomacy stalled, Chinese representatives began visiting Riyadh with a frequency that surprised even Western observers. Over the past 2 years, the number of bilateral visits between the countries has nearly doubled, and each one has resulted in the signing of agreements, from the construction of telecommunications infrastructure to the creation of joint energy research centers.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The Chinese strategy was based on a simple idea: give partners what they don't have without demanding political loyalty. For decades, the U.S. had built relationships on the principle of dependence, while China offered a choice. That is why the Saudis began to look more and more actively towards the east. The projects proposed by Beijing were concrete and tangible: roads, power plants, industrial zones, In 2024, a memorandum was signed to create the largest data center in the region with the participation of Chinese investors. According to official statements, it is intended to serve financial transactions and energy companies, but analysts suggest that it is part of a larger system, a technological alliance in which Saudi Arabia will become a key hub between Asia and the Middle East. The U.S. reaction to this rapprochement has been nervous. When the American media published information that China had offered the Saudis a satellite surveillance system to protect oil fields, Washington perceived this as a direct threat. The State Department issued a statement that such deals could jeopardize the compatibility of U.S. defense systems. But this only accelerated the negotiations.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The Saudi side, tired of ultimatums, spoke for the first time about how external security should not depend on a single supplier. These words expressed what had long been kept silent. Riyadh is ready for an independent policy. This was particularly evident against the backdrop of the new trade war between the U.S. and China. When Washington announced the introduction of 100% tariffs on Chinese imports, Beijing perceived this as an act of economic aggression. Saudi Arabia found itself in a difficult position. On the one hand, it had long-standing ties with the U.S., and on the other, growing economic cooperation with China. But the choice turned out to be predictable. A few weeks after the tariffs were announced, the Saudi Ministry of Energy announced that it had begun consultations with Chinese companies on creating alternative oil supply routes. The document did not mention the U.S. or Washington, but the context was clear. Riyadh made it clear that it did not intend to become a hostage to American trade conflicts. This was followed by changes that many experts considered historic. According to a leak from an internal IMF report, at the end of 2024, Saudi Arabia conducted its first trial transaction to sell oil in yuan, a small one, within the range of $500 million, but symbolically important.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Officially, it was called a test of the effectiveness of settlements in different currencies, but the effect was instantaneous. Chinese media called the event the beginning of a new era of energy balance, while American publications spoke of undermining the dollar system from within as Washington tried to respond. Negotiations were initiated on an additional military agreement, the expansion of joint defense programs, and new arms supplies. However, all this seemed belated. Saudi Arabia had already bet on a multi-vector approach. Moreover, there were reports that Riyadh and Beijing were considering the possibility of using the digital yuan for international settlements. This was not just an economic initiative, but a potential breakthrough that could change the very structure of the global financial system. If the largest oil exporter starts using a digital currency independent of the dollar, it will pave the way for other countries, from Indonesia to the UAE, to follow suit. Meanwhile, Chinese companies were actively strengthening their presence. In 2025, Beijing proposed a large-scale infrastructure project to the Saudis, the construction of a sustainable logistics corridor that would connect the ports of the Red Sea with Asian supply routes.
L'ordre mondial est revenu. Et même si le Canada a prospéré dans ce système, nous savons que la nostalgie n'est pas une stratégie. C'est pourquoi nous traçons une nouvelle voie à suivre pour notre pays.
Formally, it was an economic plan, but in reality, it also had a strategic dimension: the creation of a transport network independent of American maritime hubs and control over the Suez Canal. Several Western think tanks called this project a silent geopolitical revolution. The U.S. began to seriously fear that such steps would lead to the formation of an Eastern energy bloc, an informal alliance of countries where oil and gas are traded outside the dollar system. This seemed incredible 10 years ago, but now there are signs of panic, even within American financial structures. According to one of the leaks from the Federal Reserve, analysts privately warned that if at least 10% of global oil transactions switched to the yuan, the dollar could lose up to a third of its international demand. For the U.S., this is not just an economic risk, it is a threat to its entire architecture of influence. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, acted with extreme caution. Officially, the kingdom has stated that it was not seeking confrontation and was only striving for a balanced economy. But actions spoke louder than words. In early 2025, at an energy forum in Riyadh, the Chinese delegation and Saudi officials presented a joint report on the prospects for settlements in a multi-currency system.